The Battle of Bouvines was a climactic battle during the Anglo-French War of the early 13th century. The conflict arose from the rising power of King Philip II of France to centralise royal power, expanding the amount of territory the crown owned, and to curb the influence of the waning Angevin Empire. King Philip's actions clashed with the Angevin kings, first with King Henry II of England, then his son Richard the Lionheart, and then finally with Richard's younger brother, King John, who sought to retake his lands in France lost in 1204, forming a coalition with Philip's enemies. The resulting conflicts often involved various other factions like the Holy Roman Empire and the County of Flanders. Let's look at the three main characters at the heart of this conflict. This video is part of a massive collaboration between several history channels called Project Operation Deutschland. To watch more videos on German history, check out the playlist in the description tab. King Philip II of France. Crowned at the age of 14 on the 18th of September 1180, Philip developed France from a decentralised state to a stronger, more centralised one with increased royal power and more lands owned by the crown. Philip achieved this by curtailing the powers of the nobility. As of Philip's coronation, the 14-year-old boy king was overshadowed by the powerful counts of Champagne, Flanders, Toulouse, and the most powerful one, King Henry II of England, who owned more French lands than the young king. Philip wasn't just satisfied in breaking the hold his nobles had over France. He also sought to expand Paris and develop new towns, enriching himself and France. Philip was also a fine commander, and his mettle was tested against other great military commanders of the time, such as Henry II and his son Richard the Lionheart. Philip had worked both with Richard and John against their father, supporting them financially, which stemmed from the sons of Henry wanting more lands and titles. After Henry's death, Richard became Philip's greatest rival, with them both travelling to the Holy Lands and fighting in the Third Crusade in 1189. Philip would leave the crusade early and work with John to secure the Angevin Empire, with John as a weakened vassal to Philip, as Richard had been imprisoned in Germany, but would be free in 1194. The conflict between Philip and Richard would rage on until the intervention of Pope Innocent III, demanding peace for 5 years in January 1199. Richard would be dead a few months later, and Philip took full advantage of his great rival's death, invading Normandy and encouraging lords and barons within the Plantagenet Empire's domain to start an uprising against their new liege lord. This led to the Treaty of La Goulette, granting Philip more power over French territories. Yet the peace would be temporary, as in 1202, due to King John's terrible diplomacy, along with taking another man's bride-to-be, this gave cause for Philip to invade and capture more Angevin lands in France, such as Anjou, Maine and Poitou. Philip also captured one of the best castles of the age, the Château Gaillard, on the 6th of March 1204. These actions forced King John to retreat to England and regroup, setting the stage for a future fight to reclaim his lands. King John of England. A quote from Matthew of Paris, a historian of the 13th century, from his account of the reply to King John's proposal of an alliance to the Emir of Morocco. John was a tyrant rather than a king, a destroyer rather than a governor, and an oppressor of his own people, and a friend to strangers, a lion to his own subjects, a lamb to foreigners and those who fought against him. For, owing to his slothfulness, he had lost Normandy and, moreover, was eager to lose the kingdom of England or destroy it. He was an insatiable extorter of money and an invader, and destroyer of the possessions of his own natural subjects. he had violated the daughters and sisters of his nobles and was wavering and distrustful in his observance of the Christian religion. By the end of 1203, John's empire was collapsing. Despite capturing his nephew in 1202, Arthur, Duke of Brittany, who had allied with Philip and was a serious claimant to the throne of England, who, under John's care, died under mysterious circumstances while imprisoned. John lost his best and most reliable ally he had ever had, his mother, the powerful Eleanor of Aquitaine, who died on the 31st of March, 1204. John was crowned in 1199, and as mentioned before, faced an invasion of his newly acquired lands from his once ally, King Philip. And by 1204, John's power became confined to his realm of England. But John did not rest, and was as active, if not more active, than other kings of England, travelling some 30 miles in a day. And despite the loss of most of his holdings in France, John's personal wealth was incredible, thanks to not only his own administrative prowess, taxation, but also bleeding his nobles dry of money through various means, such as fines, granting peace through payments to avoid royal justice, aka bribes, and, as always in high Middle Ages England, making use of the lucrative wool trade. With such vast streams of revenue, John attempted to invade France in 1205. That failed. He tried again in 1206. That also failed. Despite these failures, it was not only England that suffered under the brutal efficiency of John's subjugation. Ireland, Scotland and Wales all would recognise his authority. Walter of Coventry, from the historical collections of Walter of Coventry, tells us of King John's power in Albion and Ireland. In Ireland, Scotland and Wales, there was no man who did not obey the nod of the King of England, a thing which it is well known had never happened to any of his forefathers. By 1206, John would clash with the Pope over the appointment of a new Archbishop of Canterbury, leading to the Pope issuing an interdict over England in March 1208. But this was an opportunity for John to make, or take in this case, vast sums of money, taking goods and chunks of land belonging to the clergy, and even more humorously, ransoming their mistresses and girlfriends. The situation with the Pope deteriorated so much so that John was excommunicated in 1209, and by 1212, plans of an invasion of England by King Philip struck fear into John, and by 1213, John capitulated towards the Pope, becoming a sworn vassal of the Pope, granting him protection from invasion. By 1214, John was in an incredibly powerful position to retake his lands in France, with the help of a powerful ally and plenty of cash to fund his reconquest. Otto IV, Holy Roman Emperor. Otto was the third son of a famous ruler, Henry the Lion, Duke of Bavaria and Saxony. Otto was related to John through his mother, John's sister, Matilda of England. Otto was brought up and educated in England within the court of his uncle, Richard I. Otto was close to his uncle, being even potentially anointed as a future heir, but this never materialised. Otto participated in a campaign with Richard in his war against King Philip. Otto's ascension to the title of Holy Roman Emperor started in 1198, when he was elected as King of the Romans. Yet Otto had to contend with a rival for the throne, as his family house, the Brunswick House, fought the Hohenstaufen House, with each house making political moves. Otto's first rival for the throne was Philip of Swabia. Philip was assassinated in 1208, and by 1209 Otto was crowned by the Pope. Although Otto still had a rival for the throne from the nephew of Philip of Swabia, Frederick. Otto sought to reclaim lands in Italy and re-establish imperial authority there, yet After reaching Rome, Pope Innocent excommunicated him in 1210. This had a ripple effect, as in the north of the empire the Danes were invading, causing princes in the empire to elect Frederick as king of the Germans, along with the support of the Pope, who asked for King Philip's support. Despite being overthrown politically, Otto still had a powerful ally, his uncle, King John, who was fanatically organising an invasion of France. Before the invasion, John had been financing a proxy war between King Philip and the barons of Flanders, while also trying to get his own lords and barons on board with the invasion, with limited success in 1213. Yet John was still gaining huge sums of money from his subjects, in one case charging a noble 10,000 marks to inherit his title. Yet in France, Philip too was organising an invasion of England, to be led by his son and heir, Prince Louis, later known as the Lion. He would be the one to take command, yet after John's capitulation to the Pope, the French invasion was called off, leaving Philip in a hellish fury. Both the Kingdom of England and France had been organising a massive fleet. At the end of May, the English fleet, commanded by the Count of Boulogne and John's half-brother, the Earl of Salisbury, surprised the French fleet in the Flemish harbour at Damme. They had originally arrived to assist Flanders, but King Philip and his army were attacking Ghent as revenge for Flanders not assisting Philip. The French ships were virtually defenceless. The English then burnt and looted plenty of booty from the French ships before sailing back with a hearty bounty. A victory of this calibre was an encouraging sign for King John. The plan of action for John and Otto, along with their allies, was for John's army to land at La Rochelle, while Otto and his allies would attack from Flanders. John hoped these attacks would keep the French king busy in the north, while he would reclaim his French territories. After all, he was returning, in his mind, to his ancestral lands, to be welcomed back by his loyal subjects. After making his realm in England stable by offering concessions to his nobles upon his return, John set sail for France, landing in La Rochelle on the 15th of February 1214. The campaign was off to a good start. He had recaptured a castle near La Rochelle, and some nobles of the area agreed to join his side. John would capture and obtain more submissions by the end of May. And soon John had reached Anjou. As for King Philip, he faced a difficult decision: face John or Otto. The king chose both. His son Louis would deal with John by restricting his movements and applying pressure where he could, and Philip would face Otto, as reports of brutal treatments to the people in Philip's land would be the most pressing to alleviate. By the end of June, early July, John was besieging La Roche-aux-Moines, while Prince Louis was stationed at Chinon, John's father's favourite place to host court. Under instructions by King Philip to lift the siege, Louis marched with his army, which was reportedly smaller than John's. King John was eager for an open battle. What happened next is dependent on which chronicles you read. One account claims that John's allies were not prepared to fight an open battle. Another account by William the Breton claims that John's French allies didn't want to fight the future King of France. Regardless of the accounts, John lost a good chunk of his army, supplies and goods on the retreat back. Whether he felt he couldn't trust his allies, or he lost his courage, or even both, John returned to La Rochelle, hoping for good news in the north. Over in Flanders, in July 1214, John's half-brother, the Earl of Salisbury, was conducting raids into French lands, as Otto was still mustering and travelling with his army. This gave King Philip the time he needed to muster an army to combat this huge coalition. Near the end of July, Otto joined up with Earl Salisbury. While the French king travelled north, the two armies would meet on the 27th of July near the village of Bouvines for battle. There are many accounts of the battle from William the Breton, who was an eyewitness to the battle, but is heavily favourable to the French king. The account which I believe is the most neutral is the account from Roger of Wendover. He was told that his adversaries had advanced in arms tip to the bridge of Bouvines, in the territory of Ponthieu. He led his armies and his standards in that direction. When he arrived at the above-named bridge, he crossed the river with the whole of his army and decided to camp in that place. Indeed, the heat was extreme because the sun is very hot in the month of July. Thus, the French took up their position near the river to refresh their men and their horses. They arrived at that river on a Saturday towards evening, and after having disposed on the right and on the left wagons drawn by 2 and 4 horses, as well as the other vehicles which had carried the food, the arms, the machines, and all the instruments of war. This army set up guards oil all sides and spent the night in this spot. The next morning, when the princes of the King of England's chivalry were told of the arrival of the King of France, they hurriedly held a council and unanimously decided for a battle. But since this day was a Sunday, the wisest in the army, and particular Renaud, former Count of Boulogne, stated that it would not be very honourable to wage a battle on such a solemn day, and to sully this day with homicide and the spilling of human blood. The Emperor Otto went along with this viewpoint, and said that if he fought on such a day, he could never boast a joyous triumph. At these words, Hugh of Bows lost his temper and, cursing, called the Count Renning a despicable traitor, and reproached him for the lands and the large possessions that he had received from the King of England's generosity. He added that the postponement of the battle to another day would bring irreparable damage, which would harm King John, and that one always has cause to repent when one has not grasped a favourable opportunity. Renaud answered Hugh with indignation. This day will prove that it is I who is loyal, and you who are a traitor, because on this Sunday I will, if need be, fight to the death for the king, while you, as usual, on this same day, you will show to all by running away that you are the evil traitor. These insulting words provoked by Hugh of Bows, similar words, soured everyone's spirits and made the battle unavoidable. The army ran to its arms and formed into ranked battalions. When they were all armed, the Allies divided themselves into 3 battalions. The first had as captains Ferron, the Count of Flanders, Renaud, Count of Boulogne, and William, Count of Salisbury. The second was led by William, Count of Holland, and by Hugh of Bows, with his Brabançons. The third was made up of German soldiers under the command of the Roman Emperor Otto. In this order they marched slowly towards the enemy and arrived at the French. King Philip, seeing his adversaries ready for a battle, had the bridge which was behind his army destroyed, so that if, by chance, some of his soldiers should attempt to flee, they could only open up a way through the enemies themselves. The king, after having arranged his troops in the area delimited by the wagons and the baggage, awaited the shock of his adversaries' attack. Finally, the trumpets sounded on both sides, and the first battalion, in which the counts we have spoken of were, threw itself so violently on the French that in a moment it broke their ranks and penetrated to where the King of France stood. Count Renaud, who had been disinherited and chased away from his county by the king, saw him, struck him with his lance, threw him to the ground, and tried to kill him with his sword. But a knight who, along with many others, had been assigned to protect him, threw himself between him and the count and received the mortal blow. The French, seeing their king on the ground, hurried towards him, and a large troop of knights put him back on his horse with some difficulty. Then the battle was engaged on all sides. Swords threw lightning flashes by falling like thunder on the helmeted heads, and the melee became furious. However, the counts we have mentioned, along with their battalion, found themselves too far removed from their companions and noticed they could not join their allies, and the latter could not reach them. Because of this, not being able to withstand the superior forces of the French, they were overwhelmed by their numbers, and the above-named counts, along with the whole of the battalion, were taken and put in chains after very great prowess and having killed a large number of the enemies. While these things occurred around King Philip, the counts of Champagne, of Perche, and of St. Paul, along with many nobles of the Kingdom of France, attacked in their turn the other two battalions and put to flight Hugh of Bows, along with all the people who had been recruited in various provinces. While they were running away like cowards, the French, with their swords drawn, pursued them all the way to the place where the Emperor stood. Then the whole of the weight of combat became concentrated on that spot. The above-named counts surrounded the Emperor and tried to kill him or force him to surrender, but he, with his single-edged sword, which he had held with both hands like a billhook, was dealing unfendable blows all around him. All those he struck were stunned or fell to the ground along with their horses. The enemies, fearing to come too close, killed 3 horses under the Emperor with lance blows. But always the praiseworthy prowess of his companions put him back on a new horse, and he threw himself anew against his enemies. Finally, the French let him go. Unbeaten, he left the battle along with his people, with no harm to him or his followers. The King of France, happy with such an unexpected victory, gave thanks to God who had granted him such a great triumph over his adversaries. He brought with him, laden with chains and destined to be locked in strong prison, the 3 aforementioned counts, as well as numerous crowd of knights and others. When the king arrived, the whole of Paris was illuminated with torches and lanterns, resounding with songs, applause, fanfare, and praise during the following day and night. Carpets and silken cloth were hung from the house. The enthusiasm was general. The victory was huge for King Philip. He had saved all he had worked for over the years, the end of the Angevin Empire and the conquest of most of the former's lands. He had captured many of his enemies and secured French lands for the crown. He also secured a 5-year truce with King John. For John, he would return to England and face the consequences of his failure. As for Otto, he soon lost power and submitted to his rival Frederick, and then retired to Brunswick, dying in 1218.